Welcome to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston's program on Mexico's presidential election and the U.S.-Mexico relations. So excited to see all of you here tonight. What a beautiful evening. I'm glad the rain stopped and a beautiful venue. Before we proceed, I would be remiss if I didn't wonderfully thank our co-host for the evening, who's just arrived, Rosemary Saloom with Literal Magazine. Please join me in thanking. Our supporting organizations include also the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce, AEM Woodlands, the Entrepreneurial Association in the Woodlands, and the Montgomery County Hispanic Chamber. So thank you to all of our supporting organizations and to our co-host. And I know all of you love coming to the Amity building, and I'm so excited to have our friends from Amity joining us this evening. We have Juan Aceveda, Sarah Sandercock, Francis Mercado, and John Hernandez. Thank you for allowing us to come here. We have so much going on at the council, and because we work in an academic year, we are kind of getting ready to gear toward the end of our season, but I hope all of you have taken the opportunity to register for our one of our final events before we kind of break for the summer, James Clapper. Have you all registered? Raise hand. Yes? Okay. Former Director of the National Intelligence. He has a new book out called Hard Truths from a Life in Intelligence. It's going to be downtown, and if you register, you get his brand new free book. His book, which is brand new, and if you register, you get it for free. So if you would love to join us, we are going to be downtown at the Bayou Place. Make it an evening, take Uber, make parking real easy for yourselves, go down there, eat at Bluefish right before, and come and join us at the Bayou Place and hear James Clapper. It's going to be a fun evening. That's May 30th. We will sell out, so make sure if you want to attend, you register this week. Very, very important if you want to get a book. All right. How many of you have been to a World Affairs Council event previous? Great. Well, there's a few hands who haven't, so I want to take the opportunity, first of all, to introduce myself. I am Mary Ann Maldonado. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council, and I am so excited that I am coming up on my 1-year anniversary. So, yay! And what we do at the Council is educate Houstonians on the importance of what's happening globally, and we do that in 3 different areas. We have these wonderful programs that we put on, that we bring in fabulous speakers from all over the world to make you more aware of what's happening, who are real-life experts, so that you really are best informed. We also have a great opportunity in that we go into colleges and universities, and we set up Student World Affairs Council clubs within those institutions. We're happy that we are taking a group of teachers that are scholarshiped out to Quebec and Montreal in just a few weeks. So if you're a teacher, if you're an educator in any way, please get involved with us. I think you'd have a phenomenal time. Also, we do global learning through travel, and we have tons of different trips, an appeal for everyone. They're 5-star rated, they're totally guided. We go to places that are kind of geopolitically on the edge, and so if you want to join us, we are taking our ambassador in residence, Kit Ashby, is taking a group out to the capital cities, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. We are also going to be taking a trip to Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. If you're so inclined and want to visit the Serengeti, hey, Tanzania is just around the corner. Ronan has taken a trip out to Cuba. We are going to do a Cuba trip again this year. And last but not least, we're going to be closing the year with a phenomenal opportunity to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Israel. We're going to be taking a limited number of people to Israel. So if you're interested in getting in on any of those trips, make sure you register pretty quick, because what we try to do is take small, intimate groups that have the opportunity to really meet and engage with one another in a learning environment. So we'd love to have you join us. Now, I am so happy that we are going to begin our program and leave the majority of the time to our experts. Our own Ronan O'Malley, who is our director of programs, will be facilitating the conversation. He has a background in an MBA in international affairs, so he's well equipped to conduct this interview today. And it is my pleasure to have our guest, Jesús Silva-Herzog Márquez, a native of Mexico City. He is a professor at the School of Government and Public Transformation of the Tecnológico de Monterrey. He studied law at Mexico's National University and completed graduate studies at Columbia University in New York. Silva-Herzog Márquez has been a Woodrow Wilson International Scholar and a visiting researcher at Georgetown University, Columbia University, and the New School University. Furthermore, he is the author of a weekly syndicated column featured in the newspaper Reforma and has written several books discussing Mexican politics and political theory. Please join me in welcoming our guest and our facilitator.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And again, I wanted to extend our greatest thanks to Amity for hosting us today, and to Littoral and Rosemary for so kindly. Rosemary and I think we first worked on this about 6 months ago, so it's great to have it finally come to fruition. And in case Jesus is not busy enough, he's also an excellent writer. Rosemary has actually just translated his latest book from Spanish into English, The Idiocy of Perfection. And it is an excellent group of 5 essays on some of the kind of most unique and dynamic thinkers, political thinkers of the 20th century. Everyone from socialists to fascists to you have a liberal, a communist, and I think romantic is the last one. And even for our Mexican audience, or anyone who, like myself, love Mexico, an essay on Octavio Paz, the Nobel laureate. And also just the last thing to mention, with a larger audience like this, we usually do our questions on question cards. They're at the end of each row, or my colleagues later on will collect them. So if you have any questions, please pass them up. And I'll do my best to kind of get through as many as I can, or combine some as we can. And just if those of you who maybe are familiar with Mexican politics, maybe bear with us a bit, just to kind of help our broader audience. Before we get to today's election, I just thought maybe you could talk a bit about, and I know it's hard to do it briefly and quickly, but the Mexican politics, basically from the time of the revolution, 1910 to 1920, a very difficult, tumultuous period. Basically it had a different name at the time, but the party that was established in 1929, changed its name, held power until 2000. And then we had a monumental election in 2000. But can you talk to a lot of outsiders that say, how is it that one party could hold power for so long? And they might have been a center or center-right party, but they also had people like Lázaro Cárdenas, a president who did a lot of leftist leading policies like nationalized oil companies or massive agrarian reform. So how is it that this one party was able to hold power so long?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here with you tonight. Thank you to the World Affairs Council and Literal magazine for the invitation. I think it's a great opportunity to talk about Mexican politics in this time where so many things are going to change, I believe. And your question, I think, is very important. To understand Mexican politics today, you need to understand the nature of a strange political regime in the 20th century. And I say strange because it was difficult to classify the Mexican post-revolutionary regime. If we could have like a metaphor to describe Mexico's political regime after the revolution, one may think of the platypus, a very strange animal that is like a bird and like a mammal, that is something that is not easily located in any box. What type of regime was that? It was an authoritarian regime, clearly. It did not have an open competition for power. It was an authoritarian regime, but it was also a civilian regime. It was not a military regime by any means, and it was basically a consensually based authoritarianism. So how could one explain such the continuation of one-party rule for 7 decades? Well, I think it was basically this ability to have a non-ideological authoritarianism that was able to regenerate its leadership through non-democratic means, and that was able to incorporate different sectors of Mexican society. It was not based in repression, as many of the Latin American dictatorships were based on, but it was based, I think, it was based on another means to control opposition. That it's not the exclusion, the repression of the opposition, but it's corruption. The basic means of the stability of that political regime was basically corruption. Many people have said that the PRI regime was sort of a reinvention of the old Porfirista type of government that was defined by one of its critics as a government based on friendship. And that means corruption. And that means that you should try to deliver the public goods to public servants as if they were private investments.
So, in essence, I mean, in a lot of ways you might say a very crafty regime, that they, instead of kind of repressing their challengers, they co-opted them and almost would bring them in through corruption or positions they'd be willing to give them. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, in this book there's an essay on Octavio Paz, and Octavio Paz was obsessed with another political regime that defined the 20th century, that was Soviet Union, the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union. And Octavio Paz said Mexico and Russia have this same obsession with monuments to the revolution and things that you put in the mouth so that nobody talks. I don't know how you say with mordaza. But the great difference was that in comparison to Soviet Russia, there was never a strong ideology. Mexico's PRI was never a church. There was never, for that reason, any excommunion or excommunication. It was impossible to commit heresy in the PRI because there was always a way to accommodate every type of dissent. So it was a very, would you say, something that is able to change with the times. It was, as you recall, it could be a regime that could accommodate a leftist politics like Lázaro Cárdenas, or a pro-business economic plan.
And just to kind of get a deeper understanding of it, when it came to the media as compared to other parts of the world where we might have had a long-standing regime, the media was controlled and curbed in certain ways, but it wasn't maybe as outright authoritarian as what we might have had in other places. Could you talk about that?
Well, I think it's an interesting aspect of that political regime that also, in comparison to Latin America, we did not see throughout the 20th century, newspapers that were crushed, news people that were incarcerated, they were co-opted. Journalism was part of the political regime in the sense that there was, for example, one very simple measure that the political regime had was the control, the monopoly of the paper that was needed to print the newspapers. So if you have a newspaper, you need a paper, and if you need the paper, you had to ring just one door, the governance door. So you should be in good terms with the guys that would sell you the paper. It was also an area where you could see some part of dissent. You could see strong criticism to the government, to the regime, because they were not really important. You could see opinion pages where you could see historians criticizing the lack of democracy or corruption in certain areas of the government. But basically, the media was like a speaker of the government. So they were basically the role was basically to transmit the government's position on policy.
And just maybe the last issue that I think in some ways is different to a lot of other countries throughout Latin America, kind of in what would be the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, is like a lot of other places, Mexico had similar issues of widespread inequality, high degrees of poverty in certain areas, a very strong, powerful kind of oligarchical structure of wealthy families at the top, and there was a middle class, but not as big as it is now, and unfortunately I think it has been growing over the last few years. But how is it that the lower kind of social strata of Mexico did not rise up and protest in the ways that might have had in Chile, Argentina, or Guatemala? Was it that the government was doing just enough to keep people satisfied, or how is it, or why is it that there weren't the similar levels of protest?
Well, I think it has to do with the means in which the workers or the peasants were organized. From the times of the revolution, the regime was able to create the corporations that held the monopoly of representation. It had this corporatist structure in which the way in which workers organized were through unions that were basically officially defined. So you would have unions that basically represented more the businessman interests or the regime interests than the direct interests of the working class, if you could use the expression.
Okay, and just to kind of, before we kind of get to the kind of more modern era, until the recent arrival in 1914 of the Morena Party, the two biggest secondary parties were PAN, which was formed in 1939. For much of that time period, it was kind of constantly in the shadows of PRI, finishing second. Some people called it the parties of Catholics and capitalists. Could you talk about PAN briefly?
Well, the National Action Party is it was a party founded in 1939 as an opposition to the Cárdenas government. It was clearly against its socialist project, against its against the role of the state in education and the economy, and it has been a coalition of Catholic politicians and liberal thinkers, if you can mix those together.
And especially the liberal, in terms of economics, or all all issues.
Liberal in not in the American sense.
Yeah.
It was basically like a conservative reaction against Lázaro Cárdenas, but its great role in the democratization of Mexico, it has been that it defined the institutional path as the means to construct a new political system. So it has been, or it was maybe, the only institution in Mexico that really believed in institutions, that believed in the importance of Congress, of local governments, of the judicial system. So I think that was the really important role that PAN played in the democratization process throughout these years.
And then lastly, briefly, kind of the somewhat more recent emergence of the PRD, the kind of spun off from the left-wing members who are unhappy with PRI in 1989. You can talk a bit about that.
It's interesting because we are talking of the PAN and the PRD, the greatest enemies in Mexico's recent history, that are now allies in this election. The PRD was founded after the 1988 elections, and it was basically a coalition of former priistas, basically the nationalist wing of the party, the leftist part of the PRI, a coalition of those priistas and the former members of the Socialist Party in Mexico, the former members of the Communist Party in Mexico, and together, I mean, these three parties, the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD, have been, or I should say, where define the triangle of possibilities in Mexico's politics. These three parties were the parties with presidential possibilities, with presidential ambitions, and clearly defined what was the scenario of possibilities in Mexican politics. You could define yourself with that compass. In the center was the PRI, the center right was the PAN, the center left was the PRD, and you could manage to understand Mexican politics with these three reference points. One of the important things in this year's election, and I don't know if we could jump to the present day. One of the interesting things that is happening right now in Mexico is that compass has been destroyed. Imagine that in the next presidential election, not the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party are relevant for the next election. It would be very strange for the American electorate. But that is what's happening in Mexico. That is the depth of what is happening in Mexican politics today. We are witnessing the destruction of Mexico's traditional party system.
And then just briefly, then we will get to the election here on July 1st. 2000, it's historic. A lot of people sometimes compare this year's election to that in terms of being kind of a tidal wave of change. Vicente Fox, the former president of Coca-Cola Mexico, gets elected president the first time. PRI has not won the presidency in 2,000 years. And then in 2006, we have the election of another PAN president, Felipe Calderon. But in the background of all that, what we might see on the outside is PRI was still winning and controlling a lot of the major kind of governors' races, a lot of Congress. Could you talk about that? That there is a change at the top, but a lot of what's underneath was still staying the same.
But we tend to concentrate our attention on the 2000 election, the presidential election, which was symbolically very important, the first time that the unbeatable party lost the election, the first time that the PRI was out of the presidential palace. So it was an historical moment in Mexico. But maybe 3 years before that election was the most important change, 1997, that maybe not many people remember as a relevant date. And that is important because in 1997, the connection between the president and Congress was destroyed. Mexico began in 1997 an era of divided government. We jumped into the waters of pluralism. That was something that we didn't know. Before 1997, the president could do this and change the laws. The president could just say that he wanted to expropriate the banks, and he would do it.
And just to be clear, it's not because of his authority, but because his party controlled Congress that they would do what he asked, right?
That's right. It was an hegemonic political system, so it had control of Congress, it had control of the governorships of the media, of the unions, etc. So 1997 was the beginning of that pluralistic atmosphere in Mexico. The year 2000 was of extreme importance because of the symbol of the defeat of the reigning party. It was received with great illusion by Mexicans. There was this idea in the atmosphere in Mexico in 2000 that we had solved our single problem, that was that the PRI was in control of the government. And the illusion that if we solved that problem, well, we would be able to solve everything. There was a fascinating poll that I like to remember always to illustrate the costs of illusions in politics, that asked what were the expectations of Mexico with the new government. And the poll showed that the majority of Mexicans were convinced that the new government, Vicente Fox's government, was going to be able to solve every Mexican problem. He was going to solve poverty, inequality, corruption, lack of rule of law, because he came from another party that was not the PRI. The poll showed two types of Mexicans. The optimists believed that Vicente Fox was going to be able to solve all the problems immediately. The pessimists thought that it would take a couple of years. And if we try to understand what 2018 means for Mexico, I think it has to do with the great deception that democratic governments have meant in our conscience. The belief that this pluralistic system, that open competition for power, did not change anything, and that was even responsible for terrible problems that we are facing in Mexico, like, for example, violence, crime, corruption.
And then just maybe the last thing I just leave from the 2000 election, before we get to the modern day, that was Lopez Obrador was previously had been, in essence the title is different, but basically the mayor of Mexico City. But he ran a very strong campaign in 2006 and lost by just about 0.5%.
That's right.
I think a lot of people of his supporters or followers felt that maybe he'd been cheated, had people out in the streets. He ran again in 2006. He lost by 2012, a smaller election, about 6.5%. But then 2012, Pri comes back into power. So where we are now, if you could just talk about it, Lopez Obrador, he left PRD, he formed his own party. A lot of you thought he was crazy to go and form his own party, a Morena party. Maybe you could talk about it, he formed in 2014, and how it's grown so quickly.
Yes. After his second defeat in 2012, Andrés Manuel López Obrador faced a really difficult scenario in his own party, in the PRD. The bureaucracy of the PRD was clearly against López Obrador. There was clearly the intention of these bureaucrats that control the structure of the party to get rid of this guy that was that held an authoritarian leadership of the party. So after his second defeat, López Obrador resigned to the PRD and took a decision that was, I thought at the time, suicidal, absurd, the worst way to end his political career. That was resigning to the political party that he once led, and to jump into the open arena to create a new political party, which is something that is not easy in Mexico's legal system. It's something very hard to form a political party. I thought it was not only suicidal in personal terms for López Obrador, but it was irresponsible because it would basically divide the left and therefore block any possibilities for the left to run for the presidency again. Well, I was clearly mistaken. López Obrador was successful in building his own party. He was successful in destroying the PRD, that is a party that is basically agonizing. And he recreated the landscape, the political landscape, and has already built the party that leads any poll that is published in Mexico. So that shows, I think, the great audacity of López Obrador. López Obrador is a politician that does not, to put it simply, play by the rules, but he challenges the rules and he creates his own rules.
And just for our audience to know, unlike a lot of countries, Mexico, you only need a plurality to win. 42, 45% could be enough to win the presidency. There's no runoff.
That's a lot. You can win the presidency with 31% of the vote, considering that we have in this election 4 options.
Mm-hmm.
So we do not have, as most of Latin American presidential democracies have established, we don't have a runoff as you can see in Argentina, in Chile, in Colombia, but we still have the American rule that the one that has more votes than the other wins.
And just,
Well, not
not
that.
exactly, we have our electoral college to keep it crazy as well, I guess.
That's another.
But, and right now, I think kind of the averages of polls is that he has about a 15-point lead, a 15%, lead. Is that, I think, pretty a good estimate?
Yes, the latest poll of polls that we can see in Mexico show that López Obrador has around 44% of the preferences, that Ricardo Anaya, the candidate of the strange coalition between the PAN and the PRD, has 29, and 25 or 24 has the candidate of the PRI. It's a very strange election in Mexican brief democratic history, because it might be, it looks like the first non-competitive election since the 1980s. López Obrador began the race on top, and he has not gone down. He has even grown stronger, and the real uncertainty as of this day is who is going to be in the second place. I think it's fairly clear that the second place is Ricardo Anaya, but there is some type of competition between the second and the third place. There's no real competition at this day, 40 days before the election, for the first place.
And I think just last week, one of the other candidates, I think she was only polling maybe 3 to 5%, of Margarita Zavala, the former wife of President Calderon. She dropped out of the race, and some people felt, well, probably most of her votes would either go to Anaya or Meade. Do you see any chance that maybe Meade would drop out, and would therefore, if a big part of that vote went to Anaya, that it could change the race? Or you think the three major candidates are going to stay?
That the candidate of the pre...
You think there's any chance, or no?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. No, the PRI is in a dramatic situation. It faces the worst scenario of its life. It is not fighting for the presidency anymore. It's fighting for its life. The PRI is, I think, out of the race, out of the presidential race, and it is showing that its possibilities to have a strong position in Congress are very weak, and that it will be unable to win one of the governorships that are going to be in competition. There are 9 governors that are going to be elected on July the 1st. It seems that the PRI will win 0. And this is also, I think this should also be underlined in terms of the nature of the earthquake that is coming to Mexican politics. Every Mexican that is living has this presence of one party, that's the PRI, that can be the head of your government, of your government, your local government, can be your president or can be your mayor. But if it's not, it is right below that position. If it's not governing, it's the strongest opposition. After losing the presidency in the year 2000, the PRI was still the key to governability in Mexico. It defined what laws could be approved and which laws could not be approved. I think for the first time in our lifetime, in Mexicans' lifetime, we may see the PRI as an irrelevant political party. This is something new.
You also talk about, I don't want to stereotype or make broad generalizations, but historically the word different voting patterns, say between the south, places like Oaxaca and Chiapas, and central Mexico as compared to kind of the more industrialized north, areas around Monterrey, closer to the border where the maquiladoras are, that where PAN might have been stronger before, but now it seems López Obrador is polling well. Is it throughout the country?
I think it's a very interesting question because there used to be a clear, sort of a clear map of party preferences in Mexico, and you would have the southern eastern part of Mexico with a very strong pre and PRD competition. The left was able to build a party structure in those southern states of Mexico that have a more of a rural composition that might be farther from the United States and with looser connections with globalization. And in the center and northern part of Mexico, you would see the competition between the PRI and the PAN. The northern part of the country was basically prohibited for the left in Mexico. The left was basically non-existent in Chihuahua, in Nuevo León. You would see that the PRD would have like 3% of the vote. Well, what is really surprising in this election is that if you see the map, you will find that Morena, López Obrador's newly founded party, is leading everywhere. It was able to crush that regional ceiling that the left used to have. So that is really surprising in the trends that we are seeing in this election.
And I think perhaps kind of like global trends around the world, or even here in the United States, I think some of the polling says, about 80% of Mexico's polls say we want a change, we want a major change. And perhaps, Morena it's a new party, it can't be blamed for the historical problems of PRI, for, Mexico's not blaming them for the system or corruption, or for PAN and President Calderon, his decision to take on the cartels and they fragmented into many, many more cartels, making much more narco violence. Why do you think it is that that Morena and especially López Obrador has been so popular?
I think Mexican campaign and the Mexican election is clearly a contemporary election in a global context. It reflects the rage against traditional politics and traditional parties and traditional leaders and the will to radically change from what has been experienced. I think that the great ability of López Obrador, the great talent of his leadership in Mexico was placing himself in the position where he is the lone opponent of a party structure that has been governing Mexico since the 1980s with no real differences between the PRI and the PAN, with nothing to distinguish between their economic viewpoints. And Morena and López Obrador can be the politician that says, I don't belong there. I don't come from that tradition. all the criticisms that we could make on his lack of coherence and his demagoguery are not relevant in this emotional time in Mexico, when basically what I believe that the electorate is saying is, we don't want to follow the same path that we used to follow in the last decades.
And I know, I guess in 5 weeks' time, anything could happen, but if we go with the presumption that it looks like López Obrador would win, maybe you could discuss what you think his presidency might look like. Maybe one of the first things to talk about is a big part of his rallying cry has been kind of to help issues of inequality, kind of help. There's still, obviously widespread poverty in certain parts of Mexico. Has it been a lot of kind of platitudes and promises, this and that, or has he put any actual policies there that he's talked about that you think will be implemented?
Well, he has put together a plan. There's a book with his concrete proposals. The only problem with that governing plan is that I don't think he has read it. Because he frequently contradicts it. So if the plan is a fairly moderate plan that was put together by a businessman that has become close to him, in his rallies, he would say just the opposite of what you can read in page 725.
And then maybe to some issues, kind of bring it back to the United States. I know with regards to NAFTA, he has said that basically if there's any renegotiation of NAFTA, or if it's some program, if the United States does something dramatic with regards to NAFTA, as Mexico and Canada, that nothing should be renegotiated during the kind of lame duck presidency the last few months of President Peña Nieto. I think he even said that he'd be worried that Peña Nieto would give the country away. What are his actual policies or statements on NAFTA?
Well, I think before addressing the NAFTA issue, I think it's important to say something about López Obrador and the United States. If López Obrador is in many ways a textbook populist, if he has this clear idea of the world that inscribes in the populist framework, he doesn't have, he doesn't buy one of the usual rhetoric of Latin American populism, that is anti-Americanism. López Obrador is not an anti-American politician. He will never say anything bad about the United States. He doesn't blame the United States for the problems of Mexico. This is something that, for example, in comparison to the Bolivarianos of the southern cone, is clearly different. López Obrador is not an anti-American politician. And that, I think, is good. It's good maybe for the bad reasons. And that is because he is not interested in what happens outside of Mexico. His nationalism is not adversarial, but it's a nationalism that believes that we can isolate ourselves from the world. I don't know if this rings a bell.
And maybe a last point, like I said, my colleagues be collecting, you have the question cards out there. Kind of on a broader sense, he's campaigned on being the anti-corruption candidate. Could you talk about, he's saying he would be the model and that would flow from that? And also, earlier you brought up the idea of the rule of law. I know a few years ago when we hosted President Calderon here, someone asked him about the narco violence, and he said, I was not trying to stamp out the cartels and attack the cartels. He said, for the first time in Mexican history, I was trying to establish the rule of law. So can you address what you think the idea of the rule of law and corruption and anti-corruption efforts will be under López Obrador?
Well, López Obrador has had this consistent discourse of saying that Mexico's biggest problem is corruption. He is, I think he is right in pointing that corruption is maybe the source of our biggest problems. But what I think it's revealing of his politics is the way he is addressing the issue. If he says that corruption is the source of our greatest problems, he is not proposing a deep institutional reform. He's not concerned of creating a new office that is going to fight corrupt politicians or fighting money laundering. What is revealing is that he is convinced that corruption will end in Mexico when he is president. Why? Because he will set such a strong example that no one will be corrupt. He has literally said, if the president is honest, his cabinet will be honest, and the governors will be honest, and the mayors will be honest. Because I will be such a strong example, a moral example for the country. I think this is revealing, because it shows that this idea of the strength of his will, the power of his example, and also how he is not really interested in laws or institutions that are, in his idea of the world, not really that important.
We'll just have a great number of excellent questions. I'll try to get through them as quickly as I can. My Spanish, if you write it in Spanish, it would be better if this was beer instead of water. So as López Obrador, Sierra va a ser. I think basically López Obrador, what will he be like? Lula in Brazil, Chavez in Venezuela, or even Putin in Russia? Or what's your prediction?
Well, I think that issues of the future can only be answered with questions. And my question, imagining López Obrador's government, is what type of López Obrador could impose himself? I didn't know if that was a coherent sentence. Because there are two López Obrador in his body. There is this populist, there is this populist that has this very ambitious agenda to create a new country, to bring about a radical change that separates Mexico's future from the past. He is not a timid reformer, but he has this radical ambition to begin a new chapter in Mexico's history. And in that ambition, he is clearly a radical politician, and he is a polarizing politician. He believes that politics is the creation of antagonisms, and he is good at it. He knows how to pick a fight and define the enemy. There's another López Obrador that is also there, and that is the López Obrador that was mayor of Mexico City. When he was governing Mexico City, he was not a radical. He was not an anti-business politician. He did not expropriate private property. He was not against private investment. He was in very good terms with the business sector in Mexico. And he was clearly a leftist politician, but was a reasonable politician that was, I would say, fiscally responsible and fairly moderate. I think those two politicians coexist in López Obrador. And what type of politician will win might depend on the circumstances and might depend also in the attitude of his antagonists.
Okay, just have a huge number of excellent questions. One, just someone had asked, kind of related to what you brought up before about the 2000 election and Vicente Fox and PAN kind of finally breaking the hold of PRI. Do you think the Mexican population will have the same expectations for big and widespread change, or they're a little more kind of refined in understanding what's possible now at this stage?
I think there's a good deal of enthusiasm for López Obrador. I think we should recognize that there is a real enthusiasm for this new type of politician. I think we should, for example, remember that also in comparison to Latin America, Mexico hasn't had a leftist administration since 1940. This is something that is unique in Latin America. You've had in almost all the region some type of leftist, labor, socialist experiments in Latin America. Mexico hasn't had that experience. So the idea that a man that doesn't come from the traditional elites, a man that comes from outside those party structures, that has the idea of bringing up radical change, well, is received by millions of Mexicans with great hope. The administration of that hope is something that is really difficult in politics, I believe.
Okay. Being in Houston, I have a lot of questions related to energy. In Houston, I suppose a lot of people noticed when President Peña Nieto decided to have major reforms of Pemex and opening up Mexico's energy market. And do you think, I know you're not an energy expert, but what do you think López Obrador might do? Some people have asked, would he do something like nationalizing, oil fields and oil equipment, as happened, in the 1930s with Lázaro Cárdenas?
But I don't think that would happen. I mean, the idea of having a president that will renationalize industries is something that I wouldn't imagine in the López Obrador administration. But having said that, it is difficult to imagine what would his real position be. López Obrador was a stubborn opponent of energy reform in nationalistic terms. Oil was basically the blood of Mexico's identity, and opening the oil industry was treason. It had this deep symbolic importance in his rhetoric. Now, if one looks at his different positions throughout the campaign, one is lost. Because you can see, you can hear in that López Obrador presentation, in the same event, I was present in one, that he could say on energy reform that, first of all, the only thing that he would do is to analyze the contracts that have been assigned so that there's no corruption there. Then he would, and that means that energy reform and constitutional reform should stay in place. And one should only analyze if there's corruption in the new contracts. Then he may say that he is willing to propose a constitutional amendment to put the rules of the game as they were before Peña Nieto's administration. And then he will say that he wants the people to have a vote. Three very different positions that not only have a different perspective on that reform, but also in the workings of a democracy.
All right, and if the audience, if you all bear with me on some of the great questions, maybe we should go to about 8:10, if you guys are okay with that. If you're okay with that, just want to try and get as many, and I'll give all of the ones, I won't be able to get all of them to Jesus. Some excellent questions here. In a variety of ways, people are asking, what do you think relations would be like between the United States and Mexico, and specifically between López Obrador and Trump? I know it's hard to predict, but what would you?
It might be an interesting show to imagine a meeting of Trump and López Obrador, because it's clear that there are many resemblances between both of them. The way that they refer to the media, the way that they insult their adversaries, their simplistic idea of the good and the bad, the resistance to get into any detail of any policy, but just have this very broad definitions of what is tremendously important and huge. But what I'm worried about is that I don't think that, I mean, looking at it from both sides, in terms of just the presidents, it would be the first time that both of the leaders in these neighbor countries are not able to recognize the importance of the other, the complexity of the links in many terms, in social, cultural, demographic, environmental, legal terms. So I think that is something to be worried about.
I have 3 or 4 questions here about I guess, and kind of in a broader sense is, where do you think they'll be after the election, and do you think the party itself is going to go through significant change?
Well, I do believe that the PRI is going to have the strongest beating of its history, and what I think it's something to consider about the future of Mexico is that we may be witnessing the creation of a new political party that would be strongly magnetic for other political forces. Morena has been able to define itself as a non-ideological structure. Morena Morena has been able to invite members of PAN, fairly conservative politicians in Mexico that have reinvented themselves as followers of López Obrador, and union leaders, and even like militia, like paramilitary fighters in Mexico. So this is also a new thing, because Morena and López Obrador's movement are not defining themselves as traditionally democratic parties do, as one organization that is defined by one perspective of the country, one basic ideology of the country, be nationalist, be it liberal, be it democratic, socialist, anarchist, if you will. But through that perspective, it would define policy and public policy, etc. Morena wants to be, in that sense, I believe, somehow of a new breed, in the sense that it is not a section of Mexico, but as the synthesis of Mexico. I don't think that is a good thing for a democracy.
Okay, maybe just for the sake of time, just two or three quick questions. We hear about, obviously, Russian attempts to influence the election in the United States, in various countries in Europe, and there's also, there's been mentions of what is the degree of Russian influence in Latin America, and perhaps in particular the Mexican election. Can you talk about that?
I don't think that I would have anything to comment on that. There has been discussion in Mexico of possible Russian influence. I don't have a clear idea of what would the Russians be interested in doing in Mexico.
And then just maybe two last points. You've kind of touched upon some of them before, but so many people asked about them, just to kind of maybe synthesize them. What do you think, if he gets elected, he would do, and would it actually change anything with regards to the widespread levels of violence, especially the narco violence, the cartels in Mexico?
I think what is interesting in López Obrador's position in that area is that I think that something that is important, that he is the only one in this campaign that clearly says that the ruling strategy has not worked. Ricardo Anaya and José Antonio Meade, his adversaries, are basically saying we should do the same thing because sometimes we will get results. We should change this or that, but basically we should be stubborn in this policy of fighting organized crime. I think López Obrador is into something when he says this is not working. 2018 is the most violent year in Mexico's recent history. There have never been more murders in Mexico than this year. It has become worse than the worst year of Felipe Calderón's administration. And I would say that there are maybe very vague propositions. Some, I believe, are basically demagogic. But there's this attitude of trying something different. One of the most polemic proposals in this campaign has been a phrase, not even a proposal, not even an idea, a phrase that López Obrador said several months ago, in which he said that Mexico should consider amnesty. That was polemic because his opponent said this guy wants to put the worst criminals in the streets. He wants to liberate the most barbaric criminals in Mexico that are beheading their enemies. I don't think that is what he's talking about. I think that what he's talking about is fairly reasonable. And that means why should the peasants that are cultivating marijuana be spending 30 years in jail? Is that reasonable? Can't we understand that their economic desperation leads them to cultivate their land and grow marijuana? Should we put them in jail, or should we try to enhance another type of production? I think it's reasonable.
And lastly, just to combine things, people have asked, number one, do you think there's any chance of an upset that he wouldn't win? And then secondly, a lot of people also asked, you touched upon it as well, but a lot of people have asked, said, would he bring in socialism? Would he basically destroy the existing institutions in Mexico? Maybe just kind of last comments on what you think his presidency would look like.
I think that in the first question, I think if we have learned something in recent times throughout the world is that polls have mistakes all the time. That you should not trust polls faithfully. Recent history shows also that experts really don't know anything about public emotions. So can we expect a surprise? Well, there could be a surprise. I cannot imagine the amount of coincidences that would have to happen for López Obrador to lose. He would have really to commit himself to lose a third time for that to happen.
And do you think millions of people would take to the streets as supporters?
I think that maybe that would be the worst scenario, yes, that López Obrador is defeated by 2% of the vote. That would be a very bad idea. And the
last idea, just kind of, people are wondering how extreme might he be? Would he destroy existing institutions? Would he try and change the Constitution, be elected, a second term, something along those lines?
I don't think so. I don't think that there's a socialist agenda in López Obrador. I don't think that there is a clear attempt to destroy constitutional order. But having said that, I think his type of leadership, his understanding of politics represents the greatest challenge that Mexican liberal democracy has faced. Not because he's going to crush the institutions, but he might erode the liberal component of those institutions.
Well, again, I'm going to give Jesus your excellent questions. I'm sorry, about 20 or 30 questions, couldn't get to everybody, so I tried to consolidate them. And again, I want to let you know, Rosemary Saloon, thank you so much for being our co-host with Liz Rawl, and she will be selling his excellent new book, the English translation of The Idiocy of Perfection, outside afterwards, and I think he's kindly going to stay to sign some as well. And again, I'd like to thank our wonderful host from Amagi, and thank all of you for coming, and thank you so much.